Okay, looks like we should be good to go on YouTube. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody out to our meeting this afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to join you as I'm back here in Virginia after battling with the traffic. I'm glad we got the technology here working. We have to start on our agenda today. We have a couple of introductions that we'd like to make. We have a couple of new interns. And I'll let Gordon first introduce them and then have the interns introduce themselves. So Gordon.
All right. As you know, we have a ton of work coming up, so we are picking up a few extra interns. So Bo, I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit about where he's from, and then he's been here for 5 days. 4 days. 4 days. So we can, and then
so he's a veteran now.
Yeah,
I've seen it all already. Yeah. So hi, I'm Bo Bayless. I'm an MPA student at the University of Utah, but I'm from Spanish Fork. I live in Provo, so it's a little bit of a drive. And yeah, I'm happy to be here. I do school and I'm interested in Utah, so that's the important parts about me.
And Chriselle is also today is her first day, so don't scare her.
So my name is Christelle. I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm a student in the MPA program, and I'm interested in government, and this is awesome being here.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And now we have the opportunity to hear from Noah Rosenberg. I assume Noah's there in the room. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, terrific. Well, Noah, as many of you may know, is currently with Better Boundaries and has been with them through much of their efforts to get the Independent Redistricting Commission passed. And so I'll let Noah take a few minutes and give us kind of his perspective on things. So Noah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chair Facer and members of the commission. It is really a delight to see you all in person, let me just say. I've had the opportunity to meet many, if not all of you before, but not always in a redistricting context. So I wanted to introduce myself and my organization. I'm the executive director for the nonprofit Better Boundaries, which was the group that started the ballot initiative in 2017 to create the Utah Independent Redistricting Commission. I want to be brief because I know you've got a lot of things on the agenda today, but I wanted to tell you just a little bit about, I think it was Commissioner Hilliard had a question about what was our goal in the last commission meeting. He asked a question about what was our goal in starting the initiative, what were we trying to achieve? And so I wanted to touch on that really quickly, but also just make myself available to you all as a resource. We started in 2017, and our goal was to reform Utah's redistricting process so that every Utahn, whether they live in St. George or Logan, whether they live in, the Uinta Basin or Tooele County, could really be part of the redistricting process, could explain the needs of their communities and how that relates to what they would like their districts to look like. And we wanted to create a process that would also boost public confidence in redistricting broadly, but also in the core foundation of our democracy. When we started in 2017, we considered a bunch of possible options for how exactly to achieve that. We ultimately settled on a ballot initiative. So we gathered more than 190,000 signatures from voters all across the state. For those of you who might not be super familiar with the requirements, you have to meet thresholds in 26 of 29 state Senate districts. So I personally led the volunteer canvassing team. I've been with Better Boundaries since its inception, but at that point, it was my pleasure to go door to door in communities all across the state, from as far south as Monument Valley and as far north as Logan. So really, we stretched the whole state because that was a requirement to make it on the ballot. We qualified for the ballot, as many of you will probably know at this point. We passed in 2018. And since then, we were able to reach a compromise with the legislature to keep the initiative in place and in effect. And you're working through that process now of putting all of the wheels of redistricting in motion. I did want to give you a little bit more information about who we are as an organization. When we started, we had 4 campaign co-chairs. It's always been our goal to be as bipartisan and sort of nonpartisan as possible. So we worked really hard to build a board of directors who are a good, healthy mix of folks who are Democrats, unaffiliated, and Republicans. Those 4 campaign co-chairs from the signature phase through the election phase were former U.S. Congresswoman Karen Shepherd, who's a Democrat, former mayor of the city of Salt Lake, Ralph Becker, who's also a Democrat, Jeff White, who is from Park City and was John Huntsman Jr.'s finance chair on his presidential race and has run for Congress as a Republican, and Blake Moore, who at the time was, just a consultant at the Cicero Group and is now the Republican congressman from the 1st District. It's always been our goal to focus entirely on process. So it's not our group's intention to ever submit a map for your consideration of districts. We view our role as being to help guide the process to make sure that folks can participate around the state. We're not ever going to come in and say, like, this is what we want a district map to look like, right? We care that people can have their voices heard. So as part of that, we'll be working actively to try and promote your public meeting process throughout the summer and fall. And obviously, if we can help in any way at all, our goal is that the legislature adopts maps that you create as a commission. That's like our highest priority. So to the extent that there's anything we can do that would be helpful to you, please let us know. Like at our core, we wanted to find a way to create a redistricting process that was really Utah driven, right? And not work within, a lot of the systems that have been set up in other states nationwide, right? So that's why we have an advisory commission, not a binding commission, right? We have a different makeup of commissioners than a lot of other states where we tried really hard to create a Utah-focused model that could be a path forward for the rest of the country to really learn from. So with that, I don't want to take up too much of your time. So if you have questions for me, I would love to answer them, but also if not, that's totally okay too.
Please, questions from the commission.
I did have one question. Are you making available, I tend to, I get your emails and I look at your website, but remind me, are you making available the software for people to get engaged with the map making process?
Yeah, so one of the
recollection.
Yeah, one of the things that I had talked to Gordon about, right, we're obviously going to be promoting people submitting their own district maps through the software program that you provide. One of the other things that I had talked to Gordon about was community of interest maps. There's been a lot of discussion about what are communities of interest, right? And so we really wanted to give members of the public the opportunity to show you on a map with a written explanation what they think their community is. So we'll also be doing some community mapping, and I plan to turn those maps over to Gordon as part of the public comment process. But every one of those maps will include, name and contact information, including the address of the person who submitted the map to us. So we'll just be acting as sort of like a messenger. And the goal there was just to give folks a really user-friendly tool to develop communities of interest with some very easy prompts about how to start thinking about what your community is, right? Is it the place that you work? Is it a faith group you're a part of? Is it your kid's school district or a rec soccer league, right? So just really simple, easy ways for anyone to engage with the redistricting process, and a tool for doing that. And the tool we're using is a free tool provided by Princeton. They have a tool called Representable that's built entirely just for community of interest map drawing. So I'd be happy to show that tool to any of you if you'd like.
Just to
Thank
follow,
you.
Does that tool set talk to the software that we're going to be using?
So it won't talk directly, right? I'll have to turn the files over to Gordon and to the commission. But the file format that it uses is just a very, Commissioner Baker can probably explain this way better than I can, but it's a very standard file format called a GeoJSON file that includes both the map data and also the written narrative that person provides when they submit their map. So all of that and their address will all be contained in one discrete file per community of interest map. So it'll be really easy for you all to sift through and see who's submitted what. what part of the state does it fall in, and then load that into your system if you'd like.
Okay.
Just don't ask me what it is.
Other questions from the commission,
I have one.
please.
I guess too, maybe my problem as a lawyer, I read it, the language, because one of the things I've always had concerns about initiatives, even court decisions, you don't know the legislative history and what people, you only have the exact language you're giving them. The one I have concern about is in section 20A-20-301, public hearing, private conversations. And section 4A says, a member of the commission may not engage in any private communication with any individual other than other members of the commission or commission staff, including consultants retained by the commission, that is material to any redistricting map or element of the map pending before the commission or intended to be proposed for commission consideration, without making the communication or a detailed and accurate description of the communication, including the names of all parties and a map, etc. I've had problems when I'm at a function, a social function, and somebody says, oh, I see you're on the redistricting commission. Let me tell you, I want to make sure Davis County is in one district, or I want to make sure this or that. What do I say? I mean, do I say, now, let me get your name? Let me write this information down. I'm going to have to make that public. What do I do?
You know, I think your legal counsel who's on the agenda tonight can probably speak to this far better than I will be able to. I am not, I confess, an attorney yet.
I going to say, let me just
But-
answer the language.
Yeah, I mean, the intent behind the language, right? And I'll speak to this a little bit. I think some of that language got adjusted in our compromise with the legislature. So I don't want to try and speak for their legislative intent, but some language similar to this, if not identical, was in the original initiative as well. And I think the goal of that section was to really encourage a process where it didn't seem like maps were being drawn one way in public and talked about in a different way in private, right? I think the goal was to make sure that if, you know, your neighbor sidles up to you and says, hey, here's a flash drive with a full map of the state on it, you can say, well, you know, neighbor, that's wonderful, but I am going to have to disclose this as a contact and like let people know that that's where this map came from. So really the goal was to try and make sure that, you know, outside maps that don't come out of public comment or out of the submitted map feedback, it's very clear where those came from if they show up at all.
Well, I guess what I just said, wait, we're going to have a website up. You can submit it there. I don't even care what you say now. I'm not listening to it. Doesn't make any difference to me.
Yeah.
The other, I noticed right above that, it said that in paragraph 3 of parentheses C, the commission shall hold the public meetings described in subsection 1 no later than August 1st of the year following a decennial year. The decennial year is defined, but I think the census started last year, went into this year, and according to that, we're supposed to have our 11 or 7 meetings before this August.
Yeah, so there was a change to that timeline made in the last legislative session that just hasn't been implemented in like.
So this is not the final.
Not quite yet. I can get you the bill number. I'm struggling to remember it off the top of my head, but yeah, there was a change in last session. I know Commissioner Chair Facer spoke to that in committee. And then I know there was another change in the special session just to adjust. Obviously, things with the census timeline have been a little bit unusual compared to anybody's past experience in prior redistricting. So.
Thank you.
A follow-up to Commissioner Hilliard's questions. In some of our earlier discussions, we came to the conclusion that conversations that did not involve drawing a specific line were not covered by the intent of the language. In your negotiation with the legislature, would that at least be consistent with what you thought you were doing?
I mean, obviously, I don't want to represent how the legislature or any of the folks from, you know, leadership who were at that negotiating table with us would explain this. But my understanding of the intent behind that section was that it was designed to make sure that maps or like instructions about a line being moved would be, as part of the public comment process, would be visible to the public. I think obviously your legal counsel can probably advise you on whether our intent was one thing or another. The letter of the law might dictate a certain practice, but our goal was not to prevent you from having a conversation about necessarily like, oh, where a public meeting could be held, or if someone asks you, I mean, I think Commissioner Hilliard's response is spot on, right? To just say, hey, we're going to be having a public meeting in your neighborhood in a couple of weeks. Just come to that, right? Or like, here's the online map tool, right? It's not, you can do it that way, and then it's all above board so that everybody can see it. I would say that would be consistent with the intent. But again, you should definitely talk to your legal counsel.
If I could just add, I just don't want to be in a position when somebody says something to me on the street or at a social gathering to say, stop. I need to get your name and your address and exactly what you're talking about. I have to make that public. I think if we do that, we're all going to be in jail.
Well, that is certainly not our intent, right? Our intent is just to promote an open process. And so I think having an answer that like what you said, right? Which is just, hey, there's this online mapping tool. We can talk about it, but I can't remember the specific details of where the precinct lines in Gunnison are. Like, just submit a map, right? I think that's the perfect answer, because it gives people something they can go do, but right? So it doesn't make them feel like you're being rude, which is definitely something I want to be sensitive to. But at the same time, it also gives you then a hard piece of data that you can use in your line drawing process.
You know what they say? You never listen. You, Commission, you're not going to listen to us. That's not going to listen to me. You're not going to do what I was going to expect. I think we're going to hear that from a lot of people.
Well, I think, our group's intent for sure is to promote the commission, right? Like our goal is to have as many people as possible participate in your process. And I think, when we all work together as Utahns, we can achieve really wonderful things. So I might sound a little naive, but like, I think that's true of this process as well, that when we all work together cooperatively, we can make anything happen, right? To put that in slightly different perspective, if I had a nickel for every time someone on this initiative had told me, well, you're not going to get the signatures, it doesn't matter, you're not going to qualify for the ballot, you can't do it, it can't be done, it's impossible. If I had a nickel for every time someone told me that this was impossible, I would not need to be here before you today, because I would own an island somewhere nice and I wouldn't have to live in 104-degree heat. But I think the fact that you are all sitting here today is a testament to the fact that things that many people would say are impossible are absolutely within reach when we work together and when we work towards a common goal. So,
just real quick, before this meeting, I met with or talked to Rosen, and I'll tell you, he has so many great ideas. It was he's a legend. So if you get a chance to talk to him, it's just exciting. And if you're not working on something that somebody told you couldn't do, you're really not working on something really worthwhile. So this is really great. And so anyway, I appreciate his work, and he still has that dynamic, forceful attitude. His only drawback, he's going to go be a lawyer, but other than that, he is just a fantastic individual. So
yeah, as Gordon mentioned, I am actually leaving for law school at the end of July. So we're hiring a new executive director, and I'll make sure to introduce you all to that person as soon as they're in place. But in the meantime, if there's anything I can be helpful with, please don't hesitate to let me know.
Where are you going to school?
UC Berkeley.
Congratulations.
Berkeley.
Yeah.
No, just a quick comment.
Sure.
My thanks to you for several years for the very hard work behind the scenes that you and a lot of others have done. I don't know a tenth of what you guys have done, but as a fellow citizen, my thanks to you for bringing about an independent commission to the state of Utah.
Thank you.
Rex,
Rex,
you're on mute.
yeah, muted.
Rex.
Thank you both for letting me know that I'm on mute, or that I was muted, and thank you to the commissioners for your questions, and thank you to Noah for taking the time to help us understand a little more about the context. I would like to turn a quick question to our council now that we have them in the flesh. It's Commissioner Hilliard has asked this question. I'm wondering, as well as Commissioner Thorne, I'm wondering what guidance that you would give the commission at this point around those issues that have been raised on communicating with the public.
That was supposed to be a segue after we finish the action items, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about in our presentation.
Okay.
PowerPoint. So if it's okay with you, I think you can just table that and then really dive in, because those are important and tricky issues that you've identified.
Perfect. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is the discussion and approval of minutes. We have minutes from our May 25th meeting as well as our June 4th meeting. Let's first talk about the May 25th meeting. I know there were some comments that went to staff on the minutes. Are there any other changes or corrections to the minutes that anybody would like to make?
I do have one. Towards the end of the minutes, it mentions that I have spoken about creating 369 maps. No. There are 300, we need to prepare 369 districts that will be represented on the maps. So if we can adjust the language to read accordingly.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, that's a lot of maps.
Please.
With those corrections and also those that Commissioner Hilliard submitted regarding titles of commissioners, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes of May 25th.
Thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second? Okay, we have a second from Commissioner Hilliard. Any further discussion? All in favor? Please say aye. Aye. Thank you. Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion carries. Now for the June 4th minutes. And again, just to recall, that was when we had the special meeting to consider council. Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes for the June 4th meeting? Okay, not hearing any. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move we approve the minutes.
Okay, we have a motion with a second. Commissioner Hale, thank you. Any further discussion? I'll call the motion. All in favor of approving the June 4th minutes indicate by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion carries. Thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is our discussion with council on a whole host of issues. And I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to council at this point. It looks like they have treasures for everybody already.
A 3-hour exam.
I can take reps and give it to you.
Thank you.
Is he coming here? Okay.
I'll mark this up.
Well, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by the volume of this, you're in good company, because there is a lot to discuss. And I think as Commissioner Hilliard already identified, there's a lot of tricky areas that we'll need to navigate. Before we get into those, I just want to express my gratitude and our firm's gratitude of the opportunity of serving as counsel for this wonderful commission. Ray Quinney views itself as a Utah firm, and we pride ourselves in being responsive and responsible, and view it as a true honor to assist you in serving the state of Utah. We are very much looking forward to better understanding these issues. I think what has been presented to you is our identification of the various laws and regulations that we'll need to navigate in the coming months. We have also recognized, and you'll be hearing after me from Professor Pursley from Stanford, who is an expert in the Voting Rights Act and redistricting, having done this process numerous times. We felt, given this new venture and uncharted territories that we're headed, that it would be important for this commission to really have that expertise and experience. And we believe between our firm and Professor Pursley that we can answer your questions and be available to you. A little bit about myself. Name again is Matt Cannon. I grew up in Salt Lake, Sugar House Park area, Highland High School grad in 1994. And then after a LDS mission to Frankfurt, Germany, attended Southern Utah University on a football scholarship where I studied English and political science. Pursued a little football after college, playing in Germany and having a cup of tea in Canada, as they call it, with the Argonauts, and then worked in government for a couple of years before going back to law school at Brigham Young University, J. Reuben Clark. I started clerking at Ray Quinney and Nebuchadnezzar in 2003. And after a clerkship with Judge Cassell after law school, have been at the firm doing litigation, and I am currently the chair of our political and election law group, which has always been a great interest of mine. Again, so grateful for this opportunity. I look forward to working with you. I will be your primary point of contact, but as you've seen, we've gathered a team of people at our firm that I believe have all the expertise that we will need as we help navigate all the various rules and regulations. My partner here, Cammie Brown, has joined me today. Thank you, Cammie. She's the chair of our litigation section. Jim Jardine is also going to be involved where appropriate and necessary, as well as a few other associates and partners in our firm. So again, thank you, and we look forward to an adventure here. With the slides here, we are going to talk about the legal issues facing the commission. And as Noah explained a little bit of the history of where we are and how it came about, we really are creating a unique history. And we, through the initiative process, this commission was created, and the structure that was negotiated with the legislature, but the general structure remained intact. Interestingly, it's once again, consistent with everything else, it's kind of new. We have a quasi-administrative and a quasi-legislative situation. Typically, anytime you are drawing lines and drawing districts, it's considered a legislative act. But it is quasi-administrative because the commission is housed in the executive branch, and its membership includes an executive branch appointee, and it is recommending maps for consideration as opposed to making the actual formal decision. Now, this simply further complicates our duty as lawyers and making sure that we guide and assist you in the way that you can to make sure that we are complying with all relevant laws and statutes and adhering to the timelines and other issues. This map I found interesting because it shows how new this whole idea is of an independent commission. But we are not alone. There are independent commissions throughout the United States that have been organized. And we have, in our initial research, been able to find some great lessons learned that we're hoping that will help assist us in guiding you all through this process as they struggle in defining specific terms and addressing a lot of the things that you've already had discussions about. So for the roadmap for the rest of my presentation, we're going to address first the ethical duties We've received some questions from the commission already on that, some compliance requirements, move into the substantive legal considerations and the procedural legal considerations, and then move on to maps. I'll touch on that just a little briefly, 30,000 foot level, and Professor Persley is really going to drill down into the criteria and some other issues. With respect to the ethical duties, the commission under the Redistricting Act has been made exempt from various requirements, most notably the entire Government Operations Code. With that said, there's also a requirement that we need to create our own budgetary procedures, accounting procedures, personnel and human resource policies, and make them substantially similar to those from which the commission is exempt. And so they exempted us and then said, oh, but go ahead and make your own. And we're so fortunate to have Gordon on board with that. And insofar as those haven't been done, we're willing to work with you immediately to get whatever needs to be done in place with that. And we've been very impressed with the work that's already been done thus far on that. So the commissioners are still subject to two primary ethical frameworks that we'll want to discuss briefly. The first is the Utah Public Officers and Employees Ethics Act. And the second is the UIRC, or the Redistricting Act, has specific ethics requirements. And Commissioner Hilliard has already discussed one, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But first, with respect to the Utah Public Officers and Employees Ethics Act, I think this is best viewed as a conflict of interest statute. It contains various requirements, but the short of it is that public officials are required to serve the public interest as opposed to a private interest. It requires the commissioners be mindful of any actual or perceived conflicts, and we can, as your council, work with you on a case-by-case basis with any questions or issues that arise. Now, with respect to the specific ethical requirements under the Redistricting Act, the first relevant language grants the commission the ability to adopt its own code of ethics. It's a may, it's not a shall. As we looked at other states, we see that Colorado had put forth a general statement clarifying their ethical framework. Michigan has done something similar. The California Constitution actually specifically placed ethical issues on there. And essentially, with what we've discussed thus far and the transparency, other issues, that is something the commission may want to consider. And it could be something as simple as putting on our website, referencing the specific ethical acts that we're already acknowledging apply to us, and making that, educating the public that, yes, these are something that we agree are ethical boundaries that we will comply with, as opposed to trying to come up with our own language. I think there's a lot of options that we can discuss as the commission sees fit as to whether or not they want to move forward with that. Second bullet point, and we could spend the next 2 hours on this, and I think Commissioner Hilliard really identified what's been keeping me up at night for the last few days and trying to say, how can we help the commissioners address this requirement? So we're subject to certain requirements related to private communications. And the big block of text really boils down to 3 things: who you may talk to. 1, you can speak with members of the commission, commission staff, and consultants freely. When you're doing that, everything's fine and open. Anyone else maybe, but depends on this second element. And the question is, what are you discussing? Are you discussing something that is material to a map or element of a map pending or intended to be proposed for commission consideration? And the fact that Chief Justice Durham is shaking her head makes me feel a little better because normally I'd be answering a question from her of, what does that mean, counselor? And I would probably not have a great answer yet, but with this collective group, I'm hopeful that we can come up with something that make sense practically for you, so you're not in those positions that Commissioner Hilliard suggests, where you have to say, hey, hold the phone, what's your name, what's your address? You know, this really is going to be a tricky situation for us to figure out. But I think the first aspect is understanding when these obligations are triggered. And I think that language, once again, it's not 100% clear or even close to that, but it does at least limit it to certain aspects of the map making process where conversations outside of that, outside of a specific map or a specific line drawing would not fall under this, under our interpretation. We're going to work together on this and hope to define, and I've already made that note, Commissioner Hilliard, for the coming weeks to try to come up with some sort of guidance that will be helpful to you as we try to navigate and make sure that we adhere to this and not get anybody in trouble on that. Moving on, and we can obviously come back to any of these, we now have some compliance requirements. And in the back of your binder and the tabs are each of the various statutes that expressly apply to the commission and the requirements. And I've noted in re-looking at the prior meetings that you've had some great training with respect to the Open and Public Meetings Act. You've also had some great training on the Government Records Access and Management Act. You'll see the Utah Public Finance website, which controls the restrictions with respect to information on our website, the Procurement Code and Budgetary Procedures Act. So those are all attached in your binder and there for your reference. And again, should any questions arise, we will obviously be making sure that this commission is adhering to those. And should you have any questions, obviously we'll address those as they arise.
Matt, I have an immediate question.
Yes, sir.
If I get a grandma request, will I call you?
Absolutely. Yep, that's something we will absolutely handle with, and there's certain time limits and ways that we need to respond to each of that. And so I think that's the benefit of having counsel, is that you don't have to deal with that, that you immediately provide that to us and we'll work with you to respond to that under the grandma laws. As far as substantive legal considerations, there are various sources of law that the commission needs to at least be mindful of. Starting, of course, with the Utah and United States Constitution. The United States Constitution requires that the times, places, and manner shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature. The Utah Constitution, for example, sets the numerical requirements for the state legislature. And then obviously the number of Supreme Court decisions starting mainly in the 1960s, Reynolds v. Sims, Baker v. Carr, those one person, one vote. Professor Persley is going to get into more detail, but leading up to the Rucho v. Common Cause and current cases. My presentation is going to focus and has focused so much on the Redistricting Act, Title 20A, Chapter 20, which I call the Redistricting Act. The procedural legal considerations include due process, basically a notice and opportunity to be heard, and an impartial decision maker, neither arbitrary nor capricious, as Justice Durham explained in the Rushton case. But then also, although it's not 100% clear whether this applies, but we view this as best practices and the way to actually make sure that we're adhering to the constitutional requirements that would apply to this commission, the record and explanation of decision-making, notice and comment, which are really baked into the process already. We just need to make sure that as we move along that we're doing those things that would make sure that it's constitutionally sound and not subject to a challenge in that regard. We have some specific statutory requirements as to the public participation in the public hearings. So the column here on the left are the statutorily required public hearings. We are here to make sure that we meet all those requirements. And on the right side, you can see are all the current public hearings that are scheduled. And as you can see, as was thoughtfully done by the commission already, making sure that they're addressing each of the statutory requirements and then obviously more. One issue that we'll come back to is that the last hearing is currently scheduled for October 2nd. And with the changes, the most recent changes to the act and our timeline, the maps are tied to, the deadline for the maps are tied to the last public hearing. And under the law, we have until October 17th to perform that last hearing. And then it would be 14 days after that, at which point we're required under the statute to submit the maps. So this was something that jumped out to us immediately to say, we're already under such an unprecedented tight window that you may really strongly consider scheduling something on the 16th or 17th to at least just maximize what's already a very compressed window. Because as it stands, if we don't get another meeting after October 2nd, our maps would be due October 16th under the statute. And as your counsel, we're going to make you get those turned in on time and do whatever we can to help. And I think that's something to consider is, hey, let's make sure we're giving ourselves at least the maximum window to do that. Now, I noted that the 17th was a Sunday, so we can talk logistics at some point, but you know, at least October 16th, I think would be an advisable thing to make sure that we have the time that the commission needs to prepare those maps.
Could we just set October the 16th with a date and time to be set? So it's set it, there's our closing meeting. We just don't know where it's going to be or what time it's going to be, but there will be one that day.
I think that would be a wise course of action. And then that way it's just made known to everybody who's following of when the expectation will be of when those maps will need to be produced 14 days after that. So I think that's a great idea, Commissioner. As far as the opportunity to comment, there are two obligations that we've identified. At public hearings, the public must be provided a reasonable opportunity to submit written and oral comments to the commission. That's all that's currently contained in the statute. There's also a website requirement that says that we maintain a website where the public may submit a map to the commission. Our view would be that the commission consider expanding some opportunities for public input, perhaps at the beginning of each public meeting by invitation, or open up other public input opportunities on our website, such as for general public comments. We've heard the importance of communities of interest and the importance of public input in helping us define those terms. And one of the themes that has really come to the fore in my mind as we've read and reread the statute is that there's a lot of flexibility. Now, we certainly have certain deadlines, but as you've all noted, as you read this and look at the definitions and the lack of definitions, and I think that was purposeful as we've done our research trying to figure out, and I think that was intended to give you, Commission, the ability and the flexibility to breathe life into some of these provisions and terms. And there's an outer boundary, but within that outer boundary is the potential and possibility for you to decide, okay, this is where we're going to go as to these issues, and this is how we're going to define this term, and using public input where appropriate and necessary and useful along the way. But it creates challenges. It certainly does with any time you're trying to adhere to statutory requirements when it is vague as to certain issues. We're in uncharted territories where courts haven't looked or interpreted what that may mean. You know, we're making history here, and so it will take a collective effort and some careful consideration. And I think, having listened to the prior meetings and caught up, your commitment to transparency and public input, I think, is going to be very helpful in allowing the commission to better define and adhere to the statutory requirements through that and through transparency. The next final few slides, I'd just like to talk briefly about the maps and the map types. We discussed the deadline for that, but we're not in the 300, but we're 3 maps for each of the following: a map of all Utah congressional districts, as you know, Senate districts, House and state school boards. As you know, under the statute, they are to garner at least 5 votes. And then there's a process of what happens if you do not garner those votes. And if that's the case, there's still the requirement that we recommend one map that is approved by at least 5 members of the commission, and then the 2 additional maps by majority, which would be 4 as we read that. Evaluation, and this is something that I don't think has been a point of discussion much yet, but there's in the statute an ability for the court, or excuse me, the commission to trigger an evaluation of a proposed map. So commission staff are required to apply standards as determined by the commission and the best available data and scientific methods to consider how a proposed map stacks up against the criteria on that issue. So that's something that we'll need to navigate at some point. Now, as far as the requirements of the act as it relates to map, we've broken that down into threshold requirements, redistricting standards or criteria, and other requirements. And here's a table of the map threshold requirements, those that are specific to under the statute. And you're very familiar with these terms, although I think we're sharpening the focus as to what they mean. On the right side is what the Legislative Redistricting Committee, and once again, we are in uncharted waters where we are on parallel tracks with the Legislative Redistricting Committee, who is already proposing some of their best practices, including the population deviation. So we're already seeing a conflict, potentially, not a conflict, but just a discrepancy, if you will, where they say a deviation of plus or minus 0.1 is what is needed for Congress, whereas the statute gives us a 1% difference between the largest to the smallest. And that's 10% also from the largest to the smallest of the House, Senate, and State School Board.
Let me ask you here, does that mean a total of 5% below and 5% above? So a total of 10%, or can you be 10% below and 10% above? So actually there's a 20% deviation.
I believe it's the former, that there's a 10% total deviation. And where I get confused is in English, between the highest number district and the lowest number district, there can only be 10% between those two.
Lowest number to figure the 10% or the highest number to figure the 10%?
You use both of them. The difference.
If you had 50,000 in a district, then you could have in a House district, you could have up to 55 in one and 45 in another. So you're 10 points between them. You couldn't have 40,000 in one and 60,000 in the other. So you're 10,000 from the deviation.
That's exactly how I understand it. And using the word deviation is a little misleading, I think, because typically when we look at a standard deviation, you're looking from the mean of, okay, how far can you go from the mean? The statute is worded a little differently to say, hey, let's take what the biggest district that we've carved and the littlest and see what the difference is between, and it can't be more than 10%. So just as Commissioner Hilliard said, that is our limit. Now, interestingly, and recently within the last few years, courts have struck down congressional maps that were well below 1% deviation. Under the Constitution, the one person, one vote, they have to be substantially the same number, and Professor Persley is going to get into that. So even though we have that as an outer limit or boundary, we need to be mindful of the risk that may be associated if we get closer to that boundary and the challenging. There's an other practical consideration in my mind. If the Legislative Redistricting Committee adopts this policy, and I confirmed it this morning, I think it's just still a draft, and I don't know if they'll officially adopt this. But if we were to submit a map with a deviation that falls outside what the Legislative Redistricting Committee's deviations are, it seems that could be a very quick basis for them to simply disregard, the legislature to disregard our proposal. I think Chief Justice Durham has a thought on this.
My question is, are those the Independent Redistricting Commission numbers are in the statute, right?
That's correct.
So the legislatures actually, if that's how it goes, well, in fact, if they adopt this, they then adopted 2 standards.
That's my understanding.
And it would be a very interesting question as to whether that was grounds for them to dismiss out of hand any maps that we proposed that comply with our statute.
Right.
Well, the argument would certainly be that it's closer to one person, one vote than smaller the differential.
Correct. And so just, these are some of the practical and legal, even though it's in the statute, though, that doesn't mean it's free from a constitutional challenge. I think as Judge Thorne recognized, saying just because we may comply with the statute doesn't mean we comply with the United States Constitution. And unfortunately, we're seeing, fortunately or unfortunately, there's a number of cases recently where, 16 people was too many because they could have done a map that had a deviation of 1 or 2 people. And Professor Persley will get into those details, but it's pretty astounding what considerations need to be there. But something we'll keep an eye on. Again, I think the Legislative Redistricting Committee still has draft written across what these practices and parameters are, so they could be subject to change, but something we'll want to monitor to avoid the issues that we've discussed today. Again, put forth maps, 4 congressional districts, 29 state Senate districts, both parallel tracks, same number of maps that are being put forth, same districts and issues there. Now, this is kind of a primer to what Professor Persley is going to talk about, but as you know, under the Act, the Commission is to define and adopt redistricting standards, and that require the maps to the extent practicable comply with a number of set criteria. And here are those criteria. So at base, the Commission is required to define and adopt, we believe, these above criteria. We do not think there's a requirement to rank order these. And in fact, I think there's a lot of practical reasons and legal reasons why that may not be in the Commission's best interest at this point. And just as an example, certain maps, when you submit 3 different maps, it may be that one map maximizes one of the criteria, another. And if the Commission boxes itself in too early or restricts itself by saying, hey, we're going to rank order this, I fear there may be a situation down the road where we may feel like, hey, we may want to get outside of that. And so another reason why we may want to wait on this is commissions across the country have really relied on public input to understand what it means to be a community of interest. And they've actually addressed that in a lot of their initial meetings and solicited information from the community to say, hey, what do you believe is your community of interest? And they did that prior to even trying to define or limit themselves to any specific definition, which we think as a council would be a wise approach to do. Just from the transparency and also just from wanting to understand and define these terms in the best way possible. My last slide before Professor Persley is the political data issue. And once again, this is a may for the Commission, where the Commission may adopt a standard that prohibits the use of the following political data. This is once again, another interesting issue that's fraught with a lot of questions and challenges in our minds that we're still trying to work through as we've scoured the United States. It looks like a lot, if not most of the commissions have adopted that, but not necessarily with this particular language. And that's where it gets a little more challenging with the type of language that's suggested. Now, that information can be used for purposes of conducting an assessment after the fact, but then it raises a question in our minds of, well, after we do that assessment, then what happens to that map if we want to modify it? If we've now analyzed any political data, I mean, there's just so many issues that we're still trying to work through. And and guide you on this. And I don't think we're prepared to make a recommendation on that, but to make some thoughts here in the coming days and weeks to decide whether it makes sense for this commission to specifically adopt. If we do, what should that language be to try to, make this as transparent and fair and adhere to the purpose of the statute. But once again, it's just a may adopt. It's not a requirement, but an option.
Does the may mean that we could take one or two of them and not all of them?
I think that would be an argument that could be made with that. I think there's enough flexibility within that language.
I guarantee you when we're through, somebody will go through with these kind of criteria to evaluate what we've done. That's why I don't want you, I don't know what it is.
Let me hit on that question as well. Obviously, what you're talking about is very clear that the fewer specific criteria we categorize, the fewer number, the greater chance of having fewer litigations. Which brings the other question as far as this commission. We are an advisory commission. We don't make the final decisions. The legislature does. In all sincerity, what is the odds of this commission being sued by anybody when it's just advisory maps in the first place?
And those are two great points, and I'll try to address both of them very quickly. I think the first issue generally may be correct, although there's certainly a risk that if the commission decides not to make enough kind of rules and codes and other things, that there's the risk that there could be a challenge or a basis, or at least an attempted challenge as to that. But I think your point's very well taken. As to the second issue, the litigation always comes from whichever map is adopted. And so this commission is, once again, as you've noted, an advisory commission. As we look down the road and we've had that type of brainstorming of like, how do we keep these guys out of litigation at the end of the day? That would be a condition precedent, I think, is that they would have to actually adopt one of our maps. Now, the hope is that, that's a real possibility. And if that's the case, it still does raise a question. Well, would they even have a basis to sue us? Would they have grounds to bring us into that litigation? What kind of relief would they ask for? It's something that I have a hard time seeing, what a colorable claim is, but I'm also have just enough experience to see there's a lot of people who tried that even without a colorable claim. And insofar as we can avoid even the headache of that, I think is our approach with you. So, and with the commission dissolving as well after a certain date, that raises questions in my mind of, hey, we're done. If you have a problem with it, you can go address that with the courts, but don't bring us into it because we're dissolved as under the statute as soon as our duties are complete.
What's the date of ours?
I thought you all had that in red pen on your calendars at home. Yes, exactly. We'll get you that. Well, and that's, there's a lot of questions at this point, and we're getting our arms around it, and we want to be super responsive, especially for those type of issues, because putting ourselves in your shoes, that's what I would be concerned about, and so we'll be doing our best. This is just the start to identify what these potential pitfalls are, make sure we're following the statute, make sure we're doing things the best that we possibly can to minimize that risk. And to that effect, unless there's more questions, please.
I have a brief question. I'm sorry. By the way, thank you. This is a really helpful, organized presentation. I just wanted to go back to the map criteria issue for a moment. Some of the general material that we've been given to read, and some of the people who talked to us in our training sessions have said, you need to prioritize your criteria. But I think you make an excellent point about don't prioritize your criteria too soon. Are you suggesting that you never get to that, or that you do that as you get more experience and more input and start to have a better idea of what you're doing?
I think it could be more the latter.
Okay.
That we're not saying that you should never prioritize, because at some point you're going to have to make those difficult decisions. The challenge will be to leave us that flexibility that we haven't put ourselves in a priority that down the road, we see a map that we really like, but it may, you know, be a little outside of what the priority is. And does that create unnecessary problems? But I do think at some point that will start to sharpen the focus of, okay, these are maybe a little higher on the priority. I think our concern was trying to do that too soon, especially without public input, which I think is helpful to understanding these types of issues. And I know the commission is super concerned about transparency and all those issues, and then have the attorneys come in and say, okay, here's what this means, and here's the priority, would be contrary to exactly what you're trying to do. And so we're being sensitive to that. And we also think it's in the commission's best interest to do that. Well, thank you. Again, I am available. My card is in each of your binders. On the back is my cell phone number. I am available 24/7. And I mean that. And so if you ever have a question or an issue, I may not have an immediate answer, but I'm good at finding people who do have the answers, and especially at our firm. And I just want to again thank you for the opportunity to serve and work with you on this.
I don't anticipate calling you, but are we allowed to call you one-on-one and have a discussion about whatever
Absolutely.
outside of a public meeting?
Absolutely.
Okay.
He's part of the consultant group that they let us have. And I want to comment too, is I called or sent stuff questions. He was on vacation. He still responded. I thought he doesn't know how to do vacations very well, but that's not a person. That's a personal issue. We don't bring that up.
Well,
So
I'm here and available and excited to work with you all. So thank you very much for your time. And I'll turn the time now over to our colleague, Professor Persley.
could we let the commission just grab dinner real quick, and that might be a good just 2 seconds, and then
Sure. We're at your
stand up and
disposal.
give yourself
Whatever
5
works
minutes
best.
to stretch your
So we'll
legs.
take a brief break to grab dinner, and then we'll have Professor Persley continue on with their presentation.
Might I ask whoever is controlling the Zoom to give me screen sharing rights?
Yeah, we'll give that.
I think we should have that turned on now.
Yep, thank you.
Perfect. All right, are we getting about ready to resume? Let's go ahead and turn the floor over to Professor Persley.
Thank you very much. I hope you all can see my screen here. It's an honor to talk to you today. My name is Nate Persley. I'm a law professor here at Stanford. I'm a law professor, a political scientist, and also a redistricting consultant. I often say you can tell when I'm being a law professor because I have opinions without data. You can tell when I'm being a political scientist because then I have data without opinions. You can tell when I'm being a consultant because, well, it depends what my client tells me to say. And so that's the capacity that I'm here in today, is to provide advice on what you all are about to undertake. And I want to say at the outset that the task you have before you is a daunting one, that within the space of roughly 2 months from the release of the census data, you'll be conducting roughly a dozen public hearings or more, as well as producing 12 maps for 4 different bodies. And that is a considerable lift. Fortunately, you have about 2 months before that to plan for it. And what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about the principles that will be governing the Utah redistricting process in light of my experience in drawing lines for many states. And so I've only worked for courts and commissions, never for political parties. And as currently stands, I've drawn roughly 10% of the existing congressional districts. And so I'm familiar with the types of criteria that you are operating under, are familiar ones that many other states have. And I'm going to go through them as well as talk about some of the challenges and pitfalls. Let me just start, though, by level setting a little bit and saying that there is no perfect redistricting plan. That there is going to be a sense in which you want to optimize along all dimensions at once. But really, what redistricting is about, it's about balancing competing considerations. And so the statute that you have and the criteria that have been imposed upon you are a set of considerations that are in tension with one another. And the process of redistricting is trying to balance those considerations to craft a plan that will lead to effective representation. So as you plan the next few months, here are some things to keep in mind. I often describe the redistricting process as involving people, process, and principles, right? And so making sure that you have the team of map makers, GIS specialists, and demographers, as well as those who can evaluate plans for racial and partisan bias is critical to have beforehand. You've already got your competent legal team that has brought me in. Then on the process, hearings both before you have the census data as well as afterwards, and to be specific about what those hearings are trying to achieve. So that whether it's to help further define the criteria that will be guiding you in the redistricting process, or whether it is to submit plans to define communities of interest, the hearings can be an absolutely indispensable opportunity for you to basically feed off the work that the communities themselves will be providing through their public participation. Then, of course, to further define the deadlines, the schedule, the stages in the evolution of the map-making process from the receipt of census data to the turning over of 12 plans to the state legislature. And finally, I'll talk about the principles, and that's what I'll spend most of my time discussing here today. I'm going to talk about the legal constraints that were briefly discussed by Mr. Cannon, as well as the criteria, both the sort of pre-criteria of compactness and contiguity, and the other criteria that are in the law. I'm going to go quickly through the law. I'm going to give you a 1 or 2 minute summary of what I teach. It takes me about a month to teach in my course here at Stanford. But what I'll try to just describe to you is that, especially when it comes to malapportionment and one person, one vote, irrespective of what the statute says, there are pretty clear federal constitutional requirements for what you have to abide by. And those are for the congressional map to either have a no deviation map, which is to say equal as possible, or to really be able to justify all of those deviations. So I will say that every map that I've drawn for congressional districts has had a deviation of plus or minus one person, not 1%, not 0.1%, one person. Now, of course, that's a complete fiction that the census data are accurate to that level. But what the jurisprudence here and the case law suggests is that if you are going to deviate, then you have to have explanations for those deviations so that if someone comes back with another alternative plan that achieves the other articulated goals but has a lower deviation, that then you may violate one person, one vote. Most prominent US Supreme Court case on that is Karcher versus Daggett, which even struck down a plan which had a deviation of under 1%. For non-congressional elections in districts, you have greater latitude. And in general, that allows for a plus or minus 5% deviation. And just so we're clear on the math, because in the colloquy before you had asked about this, what that means, that is, if you have 1,000 people in a city and you have 10 city council districts, each district must have between 105 and 95 people. Okay, that's what we mean by plus or minus 5%. Now, yes, it is possible to depart from that, and there are some examples of where states and localities will have greater deviations. But again, you end up in constitutionally dangerous territory when you do that. Even when you do depart with these deviations of plus or minus 5%, you need to make sure you don't do it for illegitimate reasons. This is not something that I would worry about with a commission. But I was the court-appointed expert in the case that dealt with this issue, where the Democrats tried to gerrymander the Republicans in Georgia by overpopulating the Republican districts and underpopulating the Democratic districts, and then the court struck that down. But the general rule for one person, one vote, you have to justify any deviations for congressional districts, and you have to you operate within 5% for non-congressional districts. When it comes to racial gerrymandering, that's the other area of constitutional concern. You can violate the Constitution in several ways through racial gerrymandering. One is as if you intentionally discriminate against a racial group, obviously not a risk, I think, with this commission. The other, though, is if you use race as the predominant factor in the construction of a district. So that if you have no justification for doing so, you end up drawing, majority African American, majority Latino district. Now, I said if there's no justification for doing so, because actually this is an area where the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act have conflicting directives. They're in tension with one another, because Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was designed in order to prevent even what is known as unintentional vote dilution, so that under certain situations where you have a large minority group, where there is that is politically cohesive, meaning that they tend to vote together, and that the white voters vote as a block to prevent the minority group from electing its candidate of choice, you may actually be mandated by the Voting Rights Act to draw a district that is majority minority. I don't know, we don't have the census data yet in Utah to see whether one of the state House of Representatives districts might fall into that bucket. But that's the only situation where you could see that a minority group might be large enough to constitute a majority in a single member district and then have an entitlement to that district. Now let me move on to the criteria. Contiguity and compactness, as well as the use of total population as the basis for the redistricting plan are, as you know, in the law, they're specified in advance of the criteria. So let me just define them for you or give some definitions. So contiguity seems like it's an easy concept, right? That it just means that all parts of the district are connected to each other, that you don't have sort of islands of one district inside another district. There are issues even with contiguity, though, that you have to be careful about. How do you deal with water contiguity, for example? Something that could be, separated by water. Usually that would be okay, given what you're dealing with in Utah, which is landlocked, even if it has lots of bodies of water. And then point contiguity. If a district is just contiguous at a point, would that be considered contiguous? So those are things you probably want to generally avoid. Secondly, on compactness. So compactness is both a kind of artistic and aesthetic concept, as well as a mathematical one. There are over 30 measures of compactness that mathematicians have come up with to describe a district as being, how close is the shape of this district to a circle, or to the smallest circumscribing polygon, or to a circle with a perimeter of the district. And the redistricting programs that I use and that your other consultants use have all of these different measures into them. And there you will if past is prologue here, you'll want to gravitate to those as metrics because they provide some objective definition. However, these different measures conflict with each other. Some of them will prioritize rectangles. Some of them will prioritize circles. Some of them will favor long, skinny districts as compared to short ones that might have small protrusions. And so while it is a mathematical concept, it is also an aesthetic one, and it does, and sort of in the old First Amendment context, right? You sort of know it when you see it. You know a non-compact, bizarre district when you see it. In addition, right, there's the Supreme Court in an unrelated area to this, actually, in a Voting Rights Act case, talks about cultural compactness. Can you describe the district as not just geographically compact, but it is roughly bringing together similar groups of people? Fortunately, the law, as you have it, says that it has to be reasonably compact. So it doesn't put some measure of compactness and codify it as a hard rule for you. But I just want to alert you to the different challenges in trying to say latch on to one measure of compactness as your lodestar. Of course, the idea of compactness, right, is in conflict with many of these other criteria that are in the law. So people don't live in neat circles in Utah, right? So you can't draw a districting plan made up of hexagons or circles so that it would nest together. And there may be geographical boundaries that provide for rough edges on districts, and that would make a district less compact. Similarly, political subdivisions might, when you put them together, create non-compact shapes, let alone communities of interest, another criterion you have in the law, where people, might, if they live along a highway, right, and that is a kind of sensible way of drawing a district, the fact that it's not compact shouldn't get in the way. I once drew, when I was appointed to draw the districts in New York, there were districts that were following the subway lines, right? Which did not look compact, but from a kind of community of interest standpoint, made some sense. So I want to just start with those threshold conditions, because even what seem like the easiest criteria are open to debate and interpretation. So moving from the mathematical to the more discretionary and fluid, and I apologize for the amount of text on this slide. I wanted just to give it to you in your packet so you could see the way that other states have defined community of interest, just so you have it. It's, so I'm not going to go and read through all of them, but the standard definition of a community of interest is a group of people defined in a geographic area with concerns of common issues such as religion, political ties, history, tradition, geography, demography, ethnicity, culture, etc. Right? And I want to emphasize, as did the person who spoke at the beginning of this meeting, the advocate for the amendment itself, that representation of communities is what redistricting is about. Okay, but at the same time, the notion of what is a community and how to prioritize different community claims is a very difficult and fraught process, right? So it is a process that that is inevitable in any redistricting experience, but it's one that is filled with trade-offs. And so those trade-offs are, as I said before, you can have communities that themselves are not compact, right? Sometimes not even contiguous. Many times they will traverse political or natural boundaries. When I was appointed to do the districts in Maryland, there was an Orthodox Jewish community that lived just on the border with Baltimore, the Baltimore boundary. And so the question was, do you essentially slice them in half by putting by just obeying the political subdivision boundary, or do you prioritize communities of interest over them? In addition, depending on how the districts are currently constructed, there could be conflict with the district cores criterion, as well as most significantly, if communities of interest become pretexts and proxies for political and partisan interests, right, then the prohibition that you have about favoring and disfavoring political parties then sort of gets incorporated into this question of communities of interest. And so it is frequently the case, and you should have your antenna up during the public hearings, right, that what are primarily partisan concerns then get filtered through the language of communities of interest in order to push districts in one direction or another. But even beyond that, assuming that with that's not a big problem that you're going to confront, how you reconcile communities that have different boundaries and sometimes overlap with each other becomes really challenging. And so how are you going to prioritize one community's claim to a district over another? Because every community is not going to be able to get its own district, right? And so thinking about, well, which communities are big enough, legitimate enough under some definition to have a claim provides some challenge. I will also say that in my experience, there are many times when communities would like to be split up as opposed to consolidated inside a district, right? And so it's all well and good to draw districts on the basis of communities of interest, but sometimes a community would prefer to have sort of two halves of two districts instead of 100% of one. And then, as I said earlier, how you define the boundaries of a community is a fraught process, though, as you heard earlier, there are now these tools like representable.org and some other public redistricting applications that allow people to draw the boundaries of their community and submit it to you. Second, and somewhat related, is the criterion that you have of following natural, geographic, or man-made features, boundaries, and barriers. And the rationale here is, of course, that this allows for kind of predictability in representation. It allows, sometimes communities themselves are defined by those boundaries, and it also, for voters, it provides kind of obvious guideposts as to where their district ends and where it begins. But depending on those man-made borders, particularly if you think about the rivers in Utah and the like, the mountain ranges, that could mean less compact districts. It could mean breaking up of political subdivisions, eroding district cores, and of course, maybe splitting communities of interest. And this is a bit of a buffet of options that you have here, where it includes natural, geographic, man-made features, boundaries, or barriers. Those are a lot of different concerns. And thinking about which ones are significant. For example, are highways significant? Are streets? Are of course rivers and those other geographic boundaries? Are those how should they be prioritized? There are some states where they will identify the significant boundaries in a state, like whether it's, say, mountain ranges in Utah or rivers and the like, and say, all right, well, that's an important boundary, and then we'll draw districts accommodating that boundary. I will tell you once, when I was appointed to do the districts in Georgia, I drew a district that I thought was beautiful. It was in the northern part of the state. It was a square district that looked just like Montana, or actually Wyoming. And but there was a mountain range that went right down the middle of the district. And so you actually had to, if you wanted to get from one side of the district to the other, you actually had to go outside the district in order to traverse it. All right, the third set of criteria is preserving the cores of prior districts. Now, why might that be important? Well, provides for continuity and district identity as well as representation. The desirability of preserving cores sort of depends on what you think of the existing redistricting plan. And how you define a core is a difficult process, right? There are ways that we can do that where you take a proposed plan and you overlay it onto the existing map, and it will tell you how similar it is. So that's a possibility. But depending on what the existing districts look like, that could be in tension with compactness, with political subdivision lines, community of interest, and the like. In addition, it is hard to think about preserving the cores of prior districts while at the same time expressly ignoring incumbency, which is one of the, or not ignoring, but not drawing districts that favor or disfavor incumbents, because those two criterion are in tension with another, right? Next, the political subdivision requirement, which is expressed in your laws, minimizing the division of municipalities and counties across multiple districts. Why is this important? To define to some extent, our counties, our cities define us as political communities. It allows for direct representation of local governments, provides recognizable guideposts for voters. And then one last thing that I think gets overlooked, and I want to pause here to just highlight something for you, and that is that it facilitates election administration. One piece of advice I would give you at the beginning of this process is to meet with the state election director so that the state election director, so that you are made aware of the issues in election administration that are affected by redistricting. When I was appointed in Georgia and I was ordered by the court just to draw districts around cities and counties and to ignore incumbency, ignore precinct lines, I'm told that the plan that I drew actually made the Secretary of State cry. And that's because depending on how you draw the districts, that affects the ballots that will be printed, that will affect the redrawing of the precinct lines. This might not be a big issue, right? But it's better to get some guidance from the state election administrator, director at the front end than to realize that maybe you've made some mistakes at the back end. And it's also quite important, it just maybe goes without saying, to have as much as an up-to-date map of the precincts that exist in the state as possible, because willy-nilly breaking up precincts can pose real challenges for election administration. And so for the various reasons as before, if you respect political subdivision lines, I mentioned the example from Maryland with the Orthodox Jewish population, right? There may be a trade-off between communities of interest and political subdivisions. There are often trade-offs between political subdivisions and, say, Voting Rights Act considerations if you have to draw a majority minority district and the like. But even if we get beyond those and just focus on what it means to respect and minimize the division of municipalities and counties, you have to make a decision about municipalities versus counties, right? And will counties be prioritized and their lines be prioritized? Now, of course, you're not going to be able to, Salt Lake County is going to have to be split in the congressional map, let alone in the state legislative maps, just because of it has roughly 1/3 of the population in Utah. And so how you split these things, and whether you obey the municipal divisions as you do the splitting of these larger counties, right, becomes important. But then also you need to think about whether the key measurement is the number of split subdivisions, right, the number of counties, for example, that are split, or the number of times a county is split. Right? Because those are two different ways of minimizing the division of municipalities, but thinking about how you, and this does become important in several plans that I've drawn that pay great attention to political subdivision lines, because what you sometimes might do is to limit the number of counties that are split, is that you sort of concentrate the pain on 1 or 2 or 3 counties so that those end up being split in multiple ways, as opposed to sort of spreading it out with multiple counties being split. And then one thing you will end up sort of holding your head in, if you're like me, sort of in frustration, is are all splits of political subdivisions created equal? Is a minor sliver that's taken out of a county just so that you can make sure that you have equal population, say for the adjoining congressional district, should that be treated the same way as a division in half of a county? Because statistically, you will still have sort of the number of counties that were split, but really are all splits created equal. Next, achieving boundary agreement among different types of districts. Now, this is going to be a very challenging criterion to satisfy, because as I point out at the bottom of this slide, it is impossible to nest, meaning to throw into sort of each district like a Russian doll, right? The number of districts from each body. So you cannot put 75 House districts into 29 Senate districts, into 15 school board districts, into 4 congressional districts. And so how you think about the prioritization of when this criterion would be violated or not is quite challenging. Nevertheless, it is, for the reasons I mentioned before about election administration, it is a desirable outcome to make sure that there is some kind of coherence between the different redistricting plans. As you go about your work, though, I would think that one of the challenges is that since you are providing 3 districting plans for each body that you are redistricting, it's not clear to me how you should think about the coherence of the lines in each plan for every other plan. So if you have 3 plans for Congress, do all of them have to line up with, say, the 3 plans for state legislature, right? And so I think that this is the kind of rule that might be sort of honored in the, I won't say honored in the breach, but it's sort of honored just occasionally, just to as a guidepost as to don't unnecessarily complicate things by having districts that are crossing over each other unnecessarily. All right, prohibiting, now to move to the political criteria. Prohibition on the purposeful or undue favoring or disfavoring of an incumbent elected official, candidate, prospective candidate, or a political party. Obviously, this is to ensure nonpartisanship, to avoid political bias, promote transparency, competition, and representation. As I mentioned before in talking about district cores, this is an inherently challenging issue on how you're going to distinguish between protecting an existing district as opposed to protecting an incumbent, though there are ways to do so, and we can talk a little bit about that. But this is a obviously one of the criteria that will be most scrutinized. Particularly if there is litigation, even though I agree with your counsel that you all are unlikely to be sued with respect to the final map. But you need to develop some theory about how do you assess both the purposeful favoring of a candidate or party as well as the undue favoring of a party, even without purpose. You've already had testimony. I listened to one of your earlier, in one of your earlier hearings, about the new methods that political scientists use to evaluate whether a district plan is an outlier by drawing up these ensemble plans, right? So you could draw, 1 million plans, and then you see, well, how many Democratic districts, how many Republican districts are there in there, and see whether a plan is an outlier. That is a possibility. But then there are also other ways that we do this through measures of what are known as partisan symmetry, the efficiency gap, mean median agreement, and the like. But once you get into that business, right, then there is often contestation about what kind of data should be used. How should, what is the most accurate way of estimating whether there is undue favoritism or the like. When it comes to purpose, that's a little bit easier, right? The question is, like, in your mind, has there been undue favoring of incumbents or political parties? I mean, I say it's easier in that we can talk that language, we understand what that means. It's often hard to, of course, suss out. when it comes to incumbency, as well as partisanship, you are going to be placed in the position of receiving plans from different groups through the hearing process. And then the question is, that will not be posed as partisan plans, but then the question is going to be, well, was there partisan intent in drawing it? Is there a partisan effect in the plan if it were to be executed? And so you're going to have to deal with not just sort of consciously partisan efforts that either the political actors engage in with you, or the people who are obviously supporting one party or another, but also what about when the alter egos of the political parties or others try to pull a fast one? So that's why you have this option to prohibit the use of political data. Mr. Cannon already told you one of my concerns with this, which is that even if you evaluate and you use political data to understand whether a districting plan is excessively partisan or not, how does the fact that you would adjust it based on the data that you learned, does that also affect the legality of the plan under the partisanship standard? One of the challenges here is that even if, and I'll say I have been in this position that courts have ordered me not to look at political data, not to look at incumbent residents. And that actually is sometimes easy for me when I have no familiarity with the state, right? That I don't know, where incumbents live or where the Democrats and Republicans live. My guess is that you all are not so privileged in that ignorance, right? And so even if you were to prohibit the use of data, it's not as if that can be expunged either from your minds or the minds of people who are submitting plans to you. So it's going to, for symbolic reasons, it might be useful not to have this kind of information in the redistricting program that you are using, but it's not as if that these kinds of political, this kind of political knowledge won't creep into the process at some point. Let me say, finally, by way of conclusion, and just open it up for questions, that time is the most important resource in the redistricting process. That there's a point at which this becomes like musical chairs, and that the music will stop, and then the plans that you have at the time will be the ones that you will recommend. You can continue every plan that I've drawn, and usually I draw them under emergency conditions for courts. Every plan that I've drawn, right? I think after the fact that there are tweaks that I could make. There's something that I could change. But you have roughly 2 months to draw these 12 plans and to conduct all the hearings. And so, like I said, there is no perfect redistricting plan. But there are critical decisions that need to be made now, particularly, literally, how are you going to draw the maps? And what is going to be the sequence of events that will lead you to in the map drawing process? How will you accommodate and bring in public participation, and how will that then translate into maps that you will either draw or adopt? It's possible you, like other commissions could, in a sense, what we call run a beauty contest for maps, right? Where you look at all the public submissions and then you evaluate them according to some criteria. In general, when I've done redistricting, it's important to me not only to get that feedback at the front end with suggestions from the public, but also to have some period in which the draft maps that I have drawn then can get criticized and get input, so that unexpected problems with the maps can be resolved before they are submitted. And so I think that you have a unique task ahead of you. I think like I said, there's nothing more important in sort of the building blocks of our democracy than the representation of communities. It is a more pressure cooker atmosphere this time than in any other redistricting cycle in recent memory because of the late census data. But I'm here to help in any way that I can, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Professor Persley. And what questions do we have from the commission? It looks like Commissioner Hilliard has a question.
I appreciate that presentation.
Commissioner Hilliard, do you have your microphone there with you?
I do.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Appreciate the presentation. This is not something new to you, I can tell. I have really two questions. The first one is, we talk about the 1% deviation for Congress, 10% for the other districts. Is that statutory or is it constitutional law? Where do we get that criteria?
That is provided in the initiative, but what I'm telling you is to put that to the side because the U.S. Constitution and the federal law on this is clear. So, you know, it's all well, and I would hate for you to abide by a state law and then have it struck down as unconstitutional. So my recommendation to you is to try to draw congressional districts as close to equal as possible. And literally the case law says nearly as equal as practicable. And then for non-congressional districts, both the school board and the state legislative districts, to abide by a plus or minus 5% threshold.
Where does that 5% come from?
That comes from the case law.
Okay.
Yeah.
As you look at all these criteria, I look at population being pretty objective. Most of the other things you talk about are subjective. You and I could look at them and disagree about them. That's why I think there's a lot of emphasis on the population issue, because you know if you miss that one, you missed everything else. How do you really give more concrete, objective factors to the other things you're talking about?
So some of these are amenable to kind of objective indicators. For example, the number of counties that are split, right? Or a number of other or precincts that are split, or so that's one. Compactness also has measures, right? So that you can say, well, you can actually score plans according to different compactness measures. Now, there are multiple measures of compactness, so you have to sort of think about whether you want to prioritize one measure over another. I will tell you in general, when I've drawn maps, what I've tried to do in the court process is that I will try to beat all the submissions on all of the criteria, you know, so that there's no doubt that if they are abiding by some mathematical criteria that you couldn't dispute it. So the ones that are amenable to mathematical evaluation, compactness, number of political subdivisions that are split. You can also mathematically talk about respecting the cores of prior districts. That again is because you can see what percent of the population in any given district remains in that district. And then on some of the partisan measures, you can do that objectively as well. And so now there are, again, many objective indicators of partisan bias, right? And so you would have a debate about which data to use and about which measures to use, but there are measures. And so you can come up with, you know, saying that this district, you know, this districting plan falls outside the range of all districting plans by a certain percent or something like that. But something like communities of interest is not amenable to a mathematical definition, right? That is something that, again, it's a critical part of the redistricting process, but you can't say, well, we satisfied 75% of the communities of interest in Utah, right? That's going to be an impossible task to achieve. Now, you could come up with things. So like if you end up deciding what the relevant communities of interest in Utah were, right? And you map them out, then you can develop measures as to how good you did. But, you know, that's generally not the way that criterion is thought about.
Thank you. Commissioner Bishop.
Yeah, you did. In fact, you maybe just said it recently. One of the questions you have in here is how do you define the core of the district? And you may have blurted out something just a second ago when you said it's a mathematical figure. Is there some definition? We've never used this before in Utah. Is there some definition that is common as to what the core of a district is? It's simply a mathematical advice. Or if there is no standard definition of a core, who gets to make the decision on what is a core?
So generally speaking, the redistricting programs will allow you to take a districting plan and then compare it to a pre-existing plan, and it will say how much of the population was moved out of any district, right? So that's one way you can operationalize this. So you can say, all right, well, 75% of the population remains in their district. That's an example of, district covariance, right? Now, we can have a larger debate about, well, that's just really about the population. It doesn't really define the core. That this could also be an aesthetic concept where you say, well, what is the kind of critical essence of the district, right? That is the main part of the district, and does that remain? As I said before, not only is that difficult to assess, but it's also potentially in conflict with your incumbency and your partisan criterion. But just on the mathematical, I don't think there is an objective definition for what the core is, because there could be so many different types of shapes of districts. And so generally we would look at the population of the district and then say, does the new district keep most of that population together?
Is there a mathematical number that people shoot for in that decision? And I understand what you're talking about, because it becomes very subjective if you try and shoot where the core actually is. But is there a number, if we're shooting for something, that becomes common or traditional in these approaches?
Not when it comes to cores of prior districts, no. Because part of the reason also is that if most redistricting criteria have to accommodate for the possibility that you're going to be losing or gaining districts. And so if you move from a 4-district plan to a 5-district plan, for example, what does it mean to respect the cores of prior districts, right? Because everything's going to be shuffled a little bit. But you can, the number that you could hang your hat on is the number of people who are transferred to new districts from old districts, right? That would be the way that it gets operationalized. And I'm happy to show show you an example statistically where you can look at how the redistricting program will express the population shifts like that.
That's good. You allow us still to make up our own minds when we're doing that, so we can line the entire thing. One last thing, is there any kind of consistency in discussions between community of interest contamination? So once a community of interest is identified, and then you put a geographical figure to that, there are obviously going to be people within that geography that contaminate it. They are not part of that community of interest. Is there anything that has been standard as you've been talking about these things that is kind of like the rule of thumb used by the professionals who do the kinds of things you do to students?
I'm trying to think. So you can come up with a measure for how well it, to what extent does the community definition really capture the people in a jurisdiction? So if you're talking, let's say you're dealing with race, how many African Americans, this is an African American community of interest in this area. Well, but if it's only 75% African American, then you're making a decision that you're prioritizing that community defining characteristic over other characteristics, right? Remember, communities of interest are not necessarily contiguous, right? They could be in different parts of the state at once, right? So if you think about religious communities, right, you might have one group in one part of the state, one group in another part of the state. They are still a community of interest, but you can't recognize that in the redistricting process. And so this is an inherently challenging standard. And so part of what I think is important is to try to think of the community of interest criterion as, non-political communities of interest, right? The ones that you might try to define, I should say non-partisan communities of interest. Like, can you define this community in a particular way so that then you could draw a district that would be justified by an appeal to say, this is a evangelical town, this is a union town, this is, the community of people who work in this factory. Those are the kinds of ways of defining it. And sometimes they are defined by I'm dealing with the redistricting right now, where they are thinking about the communities of interest with respect to other kind of geographic landmarks, like an economic development area, right, is the way they're thinking about it.
Thank you very much. Other questions from the commission? There obviously is a lot of information for us to digest, and I'm sure that as we go along, we'll have a lot more questions that will come up. But we've had some very good questions, this evening. All right, not seeing any other questions. I want to thank you again, Professor Percival. We really appreciate your insights and your expertise, and we look forward to digging deeper into this information to help us as we try and sort through all of this, and especially as we try and figure out how we want to prioritize some of these different issues as we move down the road and understanding them more carefully. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. The next item on our agenda is our discussion of communication strategy and public outreach. And so we have the folks from Love Communication that will help us talk through this.
Chair, we have a question.
Gordon, I just had a question for you. Have the slides from Professor Percival been made available to us?
So the book has every slide.
Oh, tab 2. Tab 2. Oh, thank you. I missed that. Thank you.
You were watching the screen like you should have been. So I'm congratulating you. All right. We're going to turn this. Would you like us to come over?
Yeah, we are fine.
Yeah, we can put you right up here. These people are going to tell us how we tell all the public about it.
It's not control some of them.
Without saying something. That's going to get us.
Yes.
So you can move around it.
Okay.
We're going to explain some of this stuff in a way that I can understand.
Quick introductions. Aaron Evans, we met virtually last week when we were on here, and this is partially part of the Love Communications team that will be working with you on the whole project. Let them, everybody introduce themselves individually.
I'm Megan Griffin. I am the media director at Love. I specialize in more of what we call legacy media, so your traditional TV, outdoor radio. And we have Emily as part of our digital team.
Hi, good to meet everybody. I am the SEO, social media and content supervisor at Love Communications as well. You all. I'm Tiff Smith. I'm the PR supervisor, and where Megan focuses on paid media, I focus on earned media. So the media that we don't have to pay for, kind of like.
We also have virtually we have Austin Isbell, who's not able to join us, but he's on the Zoom. And then
everyone, I'm the director of PR at Love. I am sick, and given today's current affairs, I decided to stay home because I have not gone to the doctor yet. But happy to be here.
Thank you.
And we also have Trevor Roberts.
I kind of probably going to have day-to-day stuff.
And Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I work with Megan in the media team as a media buyer.
This is Rachel's second day, so feel free to grill her. Are we ready? Okay, so we'll jump in. So based on kind of the goals of this initiative, we just want to look at how we would market this best. And really we look at kind of that marketing funnel, general marketing terms. But best thing is mass media for awareness. And really with this cause, we want people to engage with it. So we need to let them know what's going on. So that's kind of our number one goal. Then within that, we want them to move down that funnel, create engagement, where we look at social media, events, and public relations. and then finally drive that participation where they go on and actually build their own map. So just to define kind of who we're looking at within our own community, we pulled some third-party data looking at voters. This data is MRI Simmons, and they have a couple personas of political involvement. And really what we see as our target audience is that 90% of the state where they're voting or they're passive civics, but we really need them to engage in this cause. That other 10% are really the ones we're going to get anyway. They're already engaged in politics and they have a real interest in being a part of it.
They're the ones that always submitted letters to your office and called your staffers.
So we do look at data to decide what are the best avenues to reach these people. And this is current for those personas within the state of Utah, what media they're engaging with. So we see really high engagement with television and outdoor as well as online. And the online ecosystem can be very broad and vast. So we look at social media there and we see a really strong contingent there among those top 3 target groups. But we also want to see not only with if they're engaging, but how much time they're spending with these media channels. So here we look again at TV and we see they're spending nearly 30 hours a week on television. They are still engaging with radio at about 17 hours, and then a strong online presence with 27 hours. But taking all that information, we kind of, and looking at budget and goals, we decide what media we want to propose. So based on that data, our recommendation is to look at TV as kind of our baseline media. What's unique to Salt Lake DMA is that it actually reaches the whole state. So it's really efficient. You can see this map, how the rest of the country is carved up, kind of like districts. But this whole state, so we'll be efficient, we'll reach everyone, we won't exclude anyone. It's really an opportunity to partner with local media outlets. TV stations will engage in this as kind of a public good since it's nonpartisan, so we can get a lot of added value. And that added value can be anything from bonus spots to interviews to them looking at being more engaged with what Tiff and her team are proposing, and really helps extend the campaign. And we also saw high engagement with outdoor. So the benefits of outdoor are just really general market mass reach, but based on placements, we can target to communities of interest or different areas where we're not getting that engagement we want. But overall, just looking at that I-15 corridor as really high reach and creating that awareness overall.
Awesome. Moving on to paid social. So as Megan indicated, the Facebook and Instagram channels are really showing high engagement for our general population. Those are still the social media giants, as it were, for really usership and overall engagement. And so we recommend that channel both as a higher funnel awareness driver and getting that broad reach, but also for encouraging engagement. So with the paid social media channels, we can get people to, we can measure reactions to the ads, whether people are commenting, sharing, saving, but also driving link clicks and traffic to the website where they can engage with the maps, which is the most important part. So we kind of get twofold with that.
Help me understand, what is paid social media?
Yeah, absolutely. We do get this question a lot. So it's essentially ads that you see, particularly on your Facebook and Instagram channels. So ads that come in multiple formats, sometimes you can see videos, you can see them on third-party network sites sometimes, but primarily what you'll see is in your news feed when you're scrolling through. But really the key behind it is the targeting that we can put behind these channels. And so we'll get into that a little bit later, but we can essentially break down different groups. Of course, we want to target a wider demographic audience. So that's essentially anyone 1865 plus in Utah. But we can get as narrow as you'd like as well, depending on if there's a key event that we want to target around a specific time. We can actually draw a geographic radius around a specific location, just given 2 coordinates during a specific time frame and encourage physical visitation to that location. So really, again, as broad or as narrow with your geography. And so people are essentially seeing these ads on their phones while they're engaged with their Facebook and Instagram channels. that also has the broadest kind of audience demographic reach as well, age-wise, all of that. The second thing we can do is use any kind of data. This is kind of where it gets a little creepy. As you guys know, I'm sure you've seen Facebook in the headlines over the last few years, but we can still get pretty detailed with our targeting. Again, first of all, targeting the general population, but then we can leverage any kind of own data that we may have access to. So things like customer lists, that would be voter registration files, any kind of email subscriber list. So depending on how the website ends up looking, if people are actually entering in through any channel and actually subscribing and submitting their email address, we can use that email address and leverage that list of users as part of our Facebook and Instagram campaign. We can even take it a step further so as to create a model off of those users who are most engaged. We call it lookalike modeling, and that is to expand the reach of that most engaged usership. So just some fun things that we can do with the paid social channels. Then I think we're moving on to.
So we have an initial budget of 100,000, and with that budget, our recommendation is to partner with one English TV station and one Hispanic TV station. That again will provide statewide reach, and with those partnerships, we'll be able to leverage additional exposure and added value. We'll look to get as close as we can to a 1-to-1, meaning for every dollar spent, we'll get $1 back in added value. And then that here is laid out for a July launch, wanting to create that awareness for this independent process as soon as possible and keep that going through those public meetings in September, encouraging participation up into delivering that report November 1st. And then social media will support that TV broad reach with more targeted tactics, as Emily explained. And with social, we'll also look at that English and Spanish audience. So we are kind of making sure everyone is included in this. And that would be our core plan. If there's additional budget available, speaking with Gordon, we kind of jumped to a $200,000 budget. And what our recommendation there would be to add another TV station in that late August, September timeframe to really amplify the awareness during that time. And then also layer in that outdoor to, again, just amplify awareness and drive that participation during that timeframe.
I have a question for the council. The purchase restrictions for the state, you were able to streamline this by staying under the $100,000 level, wasn't that right?
So let me make sure you understand. So our $100,000 is for Love Communication, which is going to produce content. The staff itself, or the commission itself would spend this money. So it wouldn't be going to them. This would be, we spend $50,000 to a TV station. That would not be part of their $100,000.
Okay.
Yeah, we would just be helping negotiate it based on that other contract. And in this plan, we keep social media still kind of that always on presence. Another recommendation, if we want to look at really pushing participation in those public meetings, would be to place some additional print ads around those events. This plan it starts out with a couple broader market placements through Deseret News and Salt Lake Tribune for that kind of more sprinkled statewide reach, and then moving into 2-time frequency ads within each of those specific communities. This plan would be an additional $30,000. So that's kind of where we are with our media recommendations. I know there's probably going to be more questions and discussion, but we'll also move into public relations and what's planned there.
So going back to earned media, some traditional PR. So with the announcement or the kickoff of this campaign, we'd have a press release announcing it, and we'd be pitching not only TV, but radio and print, and pitching interviews with spokespeople to educate the community on the campaign and everything that we're doing. And then we want to stay relevant in the news, so we would also have consistent op-ed and letter to the editor submissions to make sure that we're remaining in front of people. And then once the town hall meetings start to kick up, we'll have local and rural PR pushes around those, and that consists of things like media advisories, press releases, general pitches, making sure that they're on all of the local community calendars, and then obviously utilizing social posting through individual channels. And then again, wanting to remain in front of people, we'll have campaign updates and recap press releases as we move through. So switching from media engagement to community engagement, we obviously want to be engaged with the community that we want to be engaged with us. So that's getting in front of them at local community events, things like farmers markets, the festivals, the fairs. And I feel like Utah has more of those than any other place that I've ever lived. They're happening daily. And then at those, we'll have handouts. Everyone loves free stuff, things that are memorable, water bottles, stickers, things like that. But then also educational things like pamphlets and flyers explaining the process, and also giving the website so people know where to go. And then we want as many people to share what we have to say. So we want to identify potential partner organizations to help promote this. And that consists of the chambers, business groups, political government groups. I won't go through all of this. If you want to actually jump to the next slide, we have—
She's going to read all of them.
One by one. I'm going to put you guys to sleep. No, I won't bore you guys, but just to give you an example, you know, we've broken down the farmers markets, the fairs, all of the festivals. Like I said, they're happening daily. And then we've also broken down some potential partner organizations from business groups, political, government, military, universities, ethnic and cultural groups, miscellaneous, and then of course all of the chambers. I think that's it.
Yeah. Question.
Can you go back a few slides to the timeline? I was looking at the difference between the television, yeah, one more, I think. Yeah, that one. Okay, the digital media is a continuous timeline over about 3 months. But the television marketing is kind of staggered and broken up into chunks. What's the thought process there?
It's
new to me.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
It's a strategy of creating enough frequency for actionable engagement. So we're kind of defined by that frequency by our budget. And so we want to keep defining what placement within a shorter period of time it has more impact. So we kind of segment it into groups. But part of that partnership we're talking about, where we'll go and make one of these stations really a true partner, just not just a vendor, is that they'll be running bonus spots throughout that flight. So there will always be a presence. It just won't be weighted at that same level.
So you're concentrating your efforts and then lightening up and then concentrating again.
Yeah, and there's a theory there too, where consumers kind of, we get bored really fast, right? And so you see an ad, you're kind of seeing it again, and then you kind of see it again, but it doesn't mean anything to you. So if it fades away and it comes back, it will have more impact.
What's the advantage of going with one station as opposed to all the stations that are in the market?
It's that partnership angle. It's really kind of holding the carrot to get as much as we can from them to make that investment as big as we can get it. If we slice and dice too much, they really won't play as nice for us. But the other thing is, within the top 3 stations, we still have the potential to reach, on here I have it estimated at whatever station we partner with, we'll reach almost 68% of the state population, 18 plus. So we won't lose much reach sticking with one station, and we'll be able to leverage that partnership. And the difference was bringing in that second station on this 200K plan was that we then are able to reach about 82% of the population. And it just creates that other leverage where if we were going to split it across all the stations, we would dilute what they're willing to give us.
I've had the experience, it's on. I've had the experience that when you buy an ad, then they're more inclined to talk about you in the news.
Yes, it makes my job a lot easier.
So if you pick one station, you probably will get better support from that one station, news, and other commentary. You may lose it on the other station. Any concern about that?
I'm fairly confident. Oh, sorry, Tiff. I'm fairly confident we can pitch and land news coverage across all TV stations. Of course, we'll get some really good in-depth stories on our partnership station, but again, this is a worthy story that I'm fairly certain we'll get some great coverage across all boards.
Different with different clients and topics and whatnot, that can definitely be a concern for something like this.
I'm sorry, is our goal to drive people to the public hearings? Or have you expanded beyond that?
Would say both drive people to the public hearings and also drive traffic to the website.
Is that really why we're going that deep into October?
Yeah,
For
I
the
think our
hearings,
goal was to collect as many comments and responses as possible. So we wanted to keep that going at the timeline we could. If you feel like there's an earlier cutoff, we can adjust that.
Well, obviously, we were talking about having
A final hearing.
Hearing on the 16th.
which may or may not actually be a final hearing. It depends on where we are. I wish I had this much money to spend on my congressional campaign. and I'm not, and we've got this planned out. All I'm looking at is some, especially on the newspaper side. I never spent that kind of money on some of these newspaper sections as well. I mean, where you're going with it is very ambitious. And if you got the money, you might as well do it. But if I was cutting back from a campaign, there are some of these newspaper sites that I just don't think are seen that often. You can get the same kind of coverage, something just by going to the D News, than you can sometimes by going to, I'm not going to say Logan Herald.
Herald Journal.
Herald Journal. Same difference.
I would say the advantage to those, to the Logan Herald Journals and the Richfield Reapers of the world is that we could target specifically to drive traffic to the drive attendance to the public hearings that are held in those cities, and that would be the strategy if we did want to use that a print media to do that.
And there's an angle of localization makes people care a little more versus the story in the D News, seeing it in the smaller paper. It might create a message that matters more to them locally.
So if I'm looking at both of these, what is the total we're actually spending there?
We're giving options. So we gave an option of 100K, we gave an option of 200K, and then that print is an add-on of 30,000. Really, we have them, they're kind of stacked in what we would say is the priority of best use of funding. If our goal is truly just to get as many comments and participation on the website as we can.
So this is the 200 plan, this is the 100 plan, and the 30 is the
correct
newspaper.
The gravy, if you would.
I got it.
So, question with the smaller newspapers, can we leverage our visits to the communities by meeting? Somebody had mentioned possibly meeting with their editorial boards while we're in those communities. Can we leverage that and be as effective, or even perhaps more effective than buying ads?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that would be part of our tactics no matter what. So we would plan on doing that and pitching you all as the spokespeople when you're down in the community, so you can speak to those rural outlets. The paid media side would just be a both.
Anytime you're spending, you're going to be more effective when it comes to media. But it is, like Austin said, that is something we're doing.
It also comes down to what we call a cross-channel approach, right? Because the idea is you kind of need to feed this message to your audience multiple times across multiple mediums. So if it's like an earned medium, if it's a grassroots, if it's a paid, and it's the same target audience, and they're seeing this messaging, the same concentrated messages from multiple channels, then that's really the most effective way to go about that if you can layer.
Thank you. Other questions from the commissioners?
Mr. Chair, just wanting to get a deeper look at all of your outreach in the fairs, the festivals, the different community organizations too. And if we identify some additional events or organizations, we can get those to you.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is kind of a jumping off point that we just started to be able to put in, but
We welcome that.
yeah, absolutely.
Again, that's who's going to design the t-shirt.
I was hoping they'd be modeling them tonight, in all honesty. So.
If we're successful in driving people to local communities, are we staging them in places that handle that many people?
We will be talking about that a little bit. So, if we find out we've made a mistake, we'll get a better venue the second time, but we're going to try to do like school auditoriums and things. And so we'll watch. If we're widely successful, which I hope, we have a too small of venues planned. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, or a contingency of even a screen outside for things we can't get in. But I doubt we're going to have that kind of attendance, but if we're successful, I would hate to have people frustrated that they can't see what's going on in our community.
Thank you.
And I just want to reemphasize how important this marketing outreach is. It's great to be doing a great thing, but it's really not that great if nobody knows you're doing a great thing. So we got to make sure people know that. So we got to let them be involved and they can participate fully with this commission. So we want to make sure they get that chance.
All right. Thank you very much. Gordon, I know we don't have an action item for this, but
So
what are the next steps moving forward?
So what I'd like to do is I feel fairly confident that we have the budget and the ability to move forward fairly quickly with the $100,000. Do you want to bring up, well, that's like, you'll have the paper in front of you, and they could start preparing the content for the TV, the social media, and the radio. So start preparing that, and then I'll bring you back an item for a budget to spend that. Now, in the meantime, I want you to think about that second TV, the outdoor signs, and the newspaper. We can always add things like that, but I think it's time to move forward very quickly. We have very short time to get this word out. I think we'll be launching our website next week, and so we just need to start driving people and make it a crescendo in the middle of September or October, middle of October.
I'm sorry, I'm slow. We've already approved $100,000, right?
Yes. Okay, no, the $100,000 is for them to create content. Now we want $100,000 to go buy.
Yeah, but these numbers are in addition to the $100,000 we've already approved.
Yes.
So these are the numbers we'd have to approve at some time.
Yes. So I'll be bringing some back to you to get a vote and to approve those to be spent in the budget. So right now, those are unencumbered funds we have available in the budget. So we want to come back and spend them. But we want you to hear the value, what was happening, so you're not hitting this cold.
Now, I seriously want to avoid Commissioner Hilliard's nightmare of going to the legislature and asking for more money. So
we'll bring you, try to, yeah, like we said, everything we've done, we funded. We have about $240,000 left to spend. I don't think the legislature wants it back, so we just need to make sure we allocate it the right way.
If we know more, we'll deputize you to go and ask for it.
Take at least 5 friends. I won't have that many by then.
We'll get you on social media. You'll have plenty. So no, so I think this, if we don't get enough outreach, I think that's a problem too. I think we need to make sure that we accomplish that. Certainly making sure we're legally sound is number one. Number two, we have to get people into the website to start mapping. If we don't do that, it's going to be, it just won't be as great a campaign as we want it to be. So we need to make sure we're doing that part of it.
So part of that information that we're pushing out will include where to go to get help to draw their maps.
Right. And I want you to also know there's a whole other part of this outreach that we're doing. We're contacting all the cities. We meet with Salt Lake City tomorrow. We had a discussion with the county. And the intent is to invite them to bring their GIS people to the different libraries, to the rec centers through the several days at a time. And then we'll push people to those locations so they can physically have somebody helping them do these things. So it's not just them, but it's a whole outreach from each of the communities, the counties, cities. We are right now negotiating a booth at the state fair. So we'll be, anybody that wants to come and eat a turkey leg with us and do your mapping there.
The temperature below 90 degrees.
We'll have water, we'll douse you, it'll be fine. I don't think the budget accommodated that, but we will have water bottles. So we're going to go to if you saw on their list, we have the county fairs we're planning to go to as well. We just think you get a good cross section of our community in each of those locations. And because of the t-shirt who Bob was designing, we're going to really draw them in.
We're going to make money out of that.
Okay. We are. Other states are going to buy that design.
So you'll save it, just have to go back to the legislature.
Yeah, we're going to save you on that. We'll be giving back money. So we'll be getting with you to finalize a budget amendment, and then we'll bring that to you. And then they're going to be off and running, preparing stuff. And now we'll tell them where to send it. What media it's going to be shown on. So I'm excited. It'll make you all TV stars.
Thank you very much. The last item we have on our agenda this evening is to discuss the schedule of public hearings. We already heard tonight one issue that we need to be thinking about, and that is that we want to make sure we don't cut ourselves short on time. And so one amendment to the travel schedule that I heard proposed earlier tonight is that we plan our last public hearing for something like September 16th, or excuse me, October 16th, so that allows us to extend the full period of map drawing before we have to hit that November 1st deadline. I know there were some other comments as well on some of the meetings. Commissioner Durham, you had something, please.
I'm just prepared to make a motion to amend the schedule to include a meeting on October 16th, either to be determined or that we schedule it someplace in the greater Salt Lake Valley, so it's not another expensive travel outlay. But it occurred to me we could look at, we're going to Glendale. Where else are we going in the Salt Lake Valley? Harriman. So we might think about something that's either east or north, Capitol Hill, someplace in the center city, maybe even Cottonwood Heights. Or North Salt Lake. That's a really interesting idea. Bountiful, of course, you get up into Davis, but it's still it's striking distance. So I'm happy to leave that to be determined, but I really think that we are going to need the time, and it just means additional input for us.
We did get a comment about the locations. I'd like to just read to you because we're trying to keep you involved with the public comments when this received. So today I'm writing on behalf of the Utah Coalition of La Raza, UCLR, and the Enriching Utah Coalition regarding the upcoming discussion item from the June 15, 21st meeting, the public outreach presented by Love Communications, and the action item discussing the public schedule and location of public hearings across the state. ULRC is excited to see Utah Independent Commission take positive steps towards creating the fair voting districts for the next 10 years. We appreciate the opportunity to weigh in on those districts and process. Regarding the public outreach plan, I suggest that they have Love Communication work on a few PSA type of announcements. Specifically, I would request that Love Communication create public awareness on the social media. The commission could share on their website, nonprofit organizations amplify the commission's message, and on their own social media reach. I expect that there would be the understanding that these items would be as is, so the message is what you intend. UIRC will also be creating its own social media assets and will be targeting to our own supporters. However, if some of the items were created in English and Spanish, would be very appropriate and amplify, other than the cost for Love Communication to make the initial artwork. The commission wouldn't incur any additional cost when the nonprofit community shares them. Regarding the action item discussion of approved schedule and locations for the public hearings across the state, I've noticed a concerning trend. Based upon the latest available census data, population and housing units estimation table from 2019, 462,051 residents in Utah identify as Hispanic. This representation is 14.4% of the Utah population. Latinos are found in all parts of the state. However, Latinos live in higher densities in some areas than others. And in interest of providing an opportunity to participate equally, I would ask the commission to reconsider some proposed alternate meeting locations. For instance, the commission had originally selected on September 3rd for Price, but is considering Ephraim or Gunnison as an alternate location. Price, Utah has a total population of 8,265, of which the census estimates 15% are Latinos. By contrast, Ephraim, Utah has a total population of 7,000, which the census estimates is only 9% of Latinos. Gunnison, Utah has a total population of 3,000, of which the census estimates 21% Latinos, but that's only 749 Latinos in their community. The greatest population of Latinos and others is in Price, which should provide a greater opportunity for public participation. Another example, the representation for the highest concentration of Latinos in the Utah House District with 49. This is Sandra Holland's House District 23 has the highest concentration of Latinos of any Utah housing district of 49%. She represents Salt Lake City neighborhoods of Rose Park, Fair Park, West Point, and others in Salt Lake City, and have other areas of Salt Lake City have substantially lower Latino populations. I'd encourage you to either consider the plan in Rose Park or ask city space at the Sorensen Community Center or in Glendale. I won't read the rest of it, but they also asked that we look at going back to Taylorsville, because again, Harriman has a lower population, and he let's see. And then they also get more input from Heber and Vernal. They did, because we were starting to look at Duchesne, and so those are the main changes. And they also recommended not going to Washington, but to St. George. So I just wanted to give you that input as a result of last time's meeting. So,
Gordon, they realize that we're trying to be a little bit different than the legislative meeting. Does it make sense that we have our meeting and the legislature has their meeting in the same town?
We discussed that at the same meeting we had that. I suspect that they heard that, they're aware of it. We're going to respond, explaining the reasons that you give us for picking the places we pick. But I think you're justified in a lot of different locations. So I just wanted to make sure we're getting public comment to you. That's the purpose of this, not to give you public comments while we're doing it. There's good reasons to go to every one of these communities.
Commissioner Durham, and then Commissioner Hale.
Well, I'd like to leave my motion on the table. It doesn't have a second yet, at least as to the date for the final public hearing.
I will second it.
Thank you. Maybe we could get that settled, then talk more about location.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to have a final meeting on the 16th with the location to be determined. Any further discussion? Not hearing any, let me call the question. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion carries. So I think we've cleared that item. So thank you, Commissioner Durham, for following up on that. Commissioner Hale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I really appreciate Gordon sharing that that message to us, the email from UIRC. And I think this is really a great example of why we want to have these good relationships with different community organizations, because I think we can learn a lot from these community organizations that know so much about their own communities. And I do love the suggestion too about being able to utilize the material that's going to be prepared for us by Love Communication. So, but just for Love, which I'm sure they're already in this mindset, to be thinking about how all of the information that it is preparing can be used most effectively by different community organizations. So, so thanks for sharing that, Gordon, and thanks to Love for again looking to different organizations throughout the state, and hopefully we can figure out something within, you know, the concerns that the LaRasa shared, that maybe we can look closely at where we're headed. Thanks.
And I want to also say that I think we're looking at the outreach that we're going to do may be different than just the commission. So I think we're going to use some of our interns to go to places, to the rec centers, to Sorensen Community Center, whatever, and maybe make you aware of it, but not necessarily make it a commission meeting, but be there to communicate, give out information, and allow people to have computers set up for people to do things. So just because we won't have a commission meeting doesn't mean we won't have a presence in a community. So I think we'll do some of these things spontaneously a little bit as we talk to each of these communities. Others we're going to plan and just go to them. And then there's going to be the formal ones where you come and hold an actual hearing. So I want you to be aware there's all levels, and not every level needs to be at all locations.
Anything sent to the commission will be reviewed by our staff to make sure it complies with the law, and then we'll see it. So if somebody says, I want my district this way, and that's all they talked about, that's not nearly as easy as somebody said, here's some considerations, or here's some maps. We would be able to see it, even though we may not personally be there.
Right. So we have, oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, we're looking at 2 public outreaches before we have census data and after. Before census data, there's really not maps to review or create. It's basically educating them and get communities of interest. And that we feel we can do and make it very comfortable for people to weigh in on that after we get the data and after you prepared your maps. Then the outreach is totally different. We still can get community of interest, but we're going to be focused on commenting on your maps. So that's going to be more of the second phase of the communication that you're going to see.
Commissioner Durham.
Thank you. I really agree with Commissioner Hale's comments, and I'm very interested in the statistics that were quoted by either LaRasa or UCLR. I mean, it is the case that Hispanic citizens in Utah are the largest minority group, and I think it really would behoove us to ensure that at least one of our meetings, and preferably more, would gather in from different communities. But I think we ought to be sensitive to the notion that we want to get some good feedback. They may have some really interesting, those communities may really want to address communities of interest issues. In any event, what I'm getting at is that I don't necessarily think tonight's the night to lock in all the locations. I think we need to look at the statistics and the suggestions that have been made and may yet be made. And we've got a little while before we have to lock down the actual location.
20 minutes. So.
At least 20 minutes.
No, and I think you bring up a good point, because we're just barely right now starting to, Commissioner Thorne brought it up, is what's the right size for things. And so we're just barely starting to talk to venues. And so we may find that venues are going to dictate something that and we may have to amend some of the things we were thinking because of what's available and what is going on in that community. So we had some football discussion, other things. We just need to make sure we're not overlapping. We want to make us as accessible as possible.
And our attorneys need to define material interest. And I don't know if that 49% figure you just gave us just violated our ethics laws right there.
Which
I maybe misread it, so it was okay. No,
okay. Good thing you didn't try to line right.
I didn't give you all the data. I skipped a bunch of it. Now you're going to get public comment, and it's going to be. We'll do a summary, but then you're going to be able to always read every word anybody gives you.
It sounds like, as I hear Commissioner Durham and others, that we still clearly have some issues that we want to sort out before we finalize which locations. But I do think that it would probably be good to at least show an intention to hold at least the dozen or so public hearings that we've talked about, which I think we've expressed, but also that we want to be. We want to pay attention to other communities that may want to engage with us. And we want to find creative ways of doing it as well, that we don't have to only engage with communities in a formal public hearing. We can engage with them in other ways as well. And so do other commissioners have any comments that they'd like to make? I know Commissioner Hilliard, you raised some questions about logistics around football games and how that might impact some of our hearings. And I think those are important things. And we might be able to solve some of those simply by swapping dates on some of them so that we aren't conflicting the same way in some communities. But other comments from the commissioners on public hearings, either on the specific locations or the dates. Commissioner Thorne.
I was thinking that given that we're all learning to do things virtually, it may be worth scheduling just a couple of virtual hearings. And especially in some smaller communities, give them a chance to have 20 minutes, 30 minutes reserved at a hearing for their concerns.
I think that's really good.
Appreciate that.
I think there's some good idea to let people see you face to faces in little places that they would only see on the
That would clearly be the ideal, but if we can't
Right.
be every place, we don't want to exclude anybody.
Yeah. And that might be a good strategy if we decide that we really do want to engage in a place like Price. Maybe we have a hearing that explicitly invites them for a specific segment of the time, even if we're not able to physically be in their community. So, any other comments from the commissioners? Commissioner Hilliard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know in Logan, we used to have town hall meetings of the legislature on Saturday morning. We had it at the Cache County Courthouse, and they covered it on their Facebook, Cache County Facebook. But it didn't cost us any money. But we were told there were as high as 1,000 to 1,500 people who either watched it while we were doing it or within the next few days. And so that way, people didn't have to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning part of the time. And I think that's an important thing to consider. Not only that we do in the newspaper and that, but people are advertised, there's going to be on Facebook, Cache County Facebook, and I'm sure most areas would do that. And even we had a position they could call in questions. So obviously those watching it at 7 o'clock could call in and give us questions.
Thank you. Terrific idea. Other comments? Well, not hearing any. I think we can direct the staff to continue to look at our locations and to continue to help us think through where we're going to meet. And as we get closer, we can finalize ultimately the set of locations that we want to be at that will reach the most people in the most engaging ways. So any other items, Gordon, from the staff that we need to be aware of?
No, I want to use our attorneys. The question gets to be adequate time to put the presentation. And it's been my experience when you have this, you want to limit people to a 3-minute or a 5-minute or some type of presentation. So you don't get somebody up taking hours telling about their life story and about how all it's impacted them. That's number one. You need a really good moderator who can handle that and let people know beforehand. Does it make much sense to say the meeting will start at 6 and end at 8? And end at 8, so people know you're going to be out of there. And I know I mentioned before, we could have a meeting, we could be available an hour before with, even if we don't have this year's maps, we use the maps 10 years ago and say, this is what we did. Tell us why that's wrong. What are the community of interest that should be picked up as we're looking at this? And every commissioner there, and just mingle with people and have staff there so they can see the pictures and do the pictures, how you do it, and then end up with a meeting from say 6 to 8 or whatever the time is. When that time's up, we're done. And I think that's my question. Is that reasonable time?
Well, and just all we have to work with is the language in the statute with respect to those public hearings, and it reads, each public hearing must provide those in attendance a reasonable opportunity to submit written and oral comments to the commission. And so I think there's obviously some flexibility there. There's not clearly defined hours or anything like that, but what the reasonable opportunity is. And I mean, the initial response of 2 hours, we'll look into that just to see, but it seems to us that there's some flexibility there. And that's,
Especially if it's accompanied by opportunity to submit a plan or comments.
Certainly. Yes, that I think that seems a reasonable on its face when you're providing those type of opportunities in a 2-hour meeting may be that, but we'll look to see if that's been addressed by the courts. I don't know if that's ever been. Obviously, this hasn't with it being new, but in other scenarios, whether that would be problematic to try to.
The other question in the meeting, I think you need to have somebody at the beginning explain the rules. In other words, somebody needs to know that you're going to do a district, you got to do compactness, you got to have population the same, these types of things. So when somebody stands up and says, I want Cache County to be one congressional district, you'll say, wait a minute, that's not 818,000 people, but I don't care. That's what I want. And so I think, yeah, again, I think it's different than one of us on the commission. I think we need to find somebody who have either credibility. And like I said, we use Pat Jones in the tax review, Greg Bell. There's some people that have some credibility with the public. And I think we need somebody who can monitor the program. If it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes or whatever at the beginning of the meeting, so people understand this is the challenges we have and this is what you need to be looking at. So you're not wasting your time.
And I would also appreciate some guidance from the attorneys on what's a material conversation if we're meeting with people for an hour beforehand.
Understood. That's on our to-do list.
It's a great question.
I like the idea because this is the people's districting plan to have the people meet you as people. So that mingling was a good idea. Maybe you can't talk about districtings or whatever, but if there's some value in making sure that people know who's behind this. So somehow having that personal interaction, I'm sure the lawyers will find a way to do that, but I think that's good.
Thank you. Anything else from the commission or from the staff?
I just wanted to just throw out one last thing. It's just that last item on the logistics of the final map.
Oh, thank you.
And just real brief, there's no decision to be made today. In talking about how we do this, there's a couple ways there's 1,000 ways we can do this. One would be to assign a GIS person to each of the 7 commissioners. You each produce 7 maps, and then we come together, and when we get an impasse, that spills off to map number 2 of that same thing. Or we could break you into community group 2, and you do the different maps. And then we'd come together, and that'd be 3 different maps that would come up. Or anyway, there's a number of logistics of how we do this.
Tell a year from next Christmas to get it done.
Yeah, and And the problem is we're based upon when we get the census data, which will be sometimes toward the middle or end of August, and our first meeting hitting September, we're thinking we're going to give you an accelerated, you'll have learned so much up to that point that we'll be able to do a very accelerated going from no map to a final map, considering everything you've heard the last several months of districting. So I'm not saying one way is better or worse. I think that my recommendation to the communication group is that we would do a reality spotlight. We'd have cameras in your home with that worker, and you would just be, and that would be an online item that they'd be totally transparent for 24 hours. You would have somebody in your home videotaping you creating the maps with our GIS team. It would be, so we have all those options, and I'm
another way to raise some money.
yes. Commissioner Bishop, your wife sleeps. That's a great idea. So I'm just telling you, I sold you on it. So.
Well, just before you come up with the criteria of how you're going to handle that, just remember, I think it was 2010 map. That was the 2010 map where the legislature decided to have a vote on everything and throw out those that didn't quite get majority. And they went through 13 maps and eliminated all 13. And then you started over again. So this has got to be a work in progress as you do this. And there's got to be some point where this committee has got to come with a preferred map. And having a rigid way of how you do that, how you eliminate things that aren't there, it's fraught with problems. Just like even the town halls are going to be fraught with problems in the first place. Yeah. And you mentioned it with the amount of time it takes to do a town hall. Right? From all the town halls, I promise you, after an hour and a half, the quality of discussion peters off really dramatically. So any town hall meeting is going to be more than an hour and a half. You got some real problems. However, if you do some communication ahead of time, that's going to be an entirely different thing that could be possible. And then limiting the length of a comment, as long as they have the ability of doing a written reply in addition to that, you got to do that. But there has to be some kind of limitation.
And that's an access issue. When one person takes up half the meeting, that eliminates all kinds of other useful comments.
Oh, sometimes that helps.
Well, you never know. That's right. I must say that obviously it's the case that when we start winnowing down and making choices for submission, that's going to be a group discussion and group decision making. I would tend to think we might facilitate that by maybe having two-person teams working on initial maps rather than every single commissioner. Again, just a suggestion, but my notion being that we'd already be engaging in dialogue and getting feedback on our own ideas at an earlier stage. But plus, I'm absolutely terrified of being alone with a GI.
We all are.
Person and a computer all by myself.
Oh yeah, there's more than you need to know on that.
Would there be a problem with commissioners getting together, talking about commission business without it being a public hearing? As long as it's just us and staff.
We would,
and as long as we don't get hit quorum is another issue. So
yeah, I think as long as we have staff or consultants working with you,
as the individual,
or two together, we can put two. It says, I think they said you can talk together if you can't talk to the public, if I understood.
Well, I think there's two separate buckets here. Talking to the public, we discuss kind of those limitations under the statute, discussing particular maps, but then there's also internal discussion of what needs to be public. And short of a quorum, that would be the triggering event that would require that to be made public. If there's a quorum present, then any official discussion on the maps would need to be open to the public.
Quorum is for. There's different.
Yes.
That is my understanding is it's for. I will double check on that.
Anyway, I want you to think about how when we do this, sometimes the public views government going into a room, smoke-filled room, coming out the maps. And so even though I was joking about the Kardashian thing, we could.
I promise not to smoke.
Yeah. I think in some way that to let the public see how the maps develop would be good. But I think there's some of the part that's fairly boring and we'd let you do that. But then once we start really debating how these things come together, I think trying to make sure we invite the public to that focal point of creating the maps is, I think, the essence of what we're trying to accomplish with the transparency. So I'm just wanting to think.
Like the old admonition about watching sausage and a law being made.
They still want to see it. We're still gonna, what passes for entertainment, this will be right up there as high quality.
All right.
That's all I have.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. You reminding me of that last agenda item, Gordon. And I appreciate all of you, taking the time this evening, this afternoon, and look forward to seeing you again on, I believe our next meeting is on the 29th. And if you have items that you want to make sure we cover, please let Gordon or I know, and we'll make sure we get them on the agenda. So anything else for the good of the order? Not hearing any. Can I have a motion to close the meeting?
Oh, okay, I move we adjourn.
Thank you. Adjourning would be better than closing. Thank you, Commissioner Hilliard. So we'll end the meeting tonight and take care. And I look forward to seeing you all soon.